And this is one that, you know, we both, I think, we need to sort of emphasize when talking with colleagues and also with other students, is that the solution to political polarization is probably not about finding just the right way to disabuse, quote, idiots of, quote, stupid ideas. And oftentimes people say, you know, how can we solve this impasse? By which they mean, how can I convince these idiots that they're wrong, right? This is a sort of a common response. So that's probably not the right solution, but just in case, we should probably talk some strategies about how to do that anyway. So I don't know if any of you have had a chance to take a look at Daniel Kahneman's book. Daniel Kahneman's a Nobel laureate with a Nobel Prize winning research agenda with Amos Tversky, and we'll talk a little bit about it. But one of the really interesting, this is a really long book, it's sort of the culmination of his research, and one of the key themes that he develops throughout the book is this, what he calls a dual processing model, which psychologists have developed over quite some time. And basically the argument here is that, you know, the metaphor is that there's two systems in human cognition. A system one, which is an intuitive system, which is quick, it responds instantaneously to events. It's sort of a, you know, emotions are often triggered in system one. That's the first system. And system two, which is the rational system, is our sort of careful consideration of facts, you know, our careful assessment of evidence, and so on and so forth. And his argument, which he proves through a variety of experiments, or supports through a variety of experiments, is that most of our thinking is actually rooted in system one. Most of our thinking is actually sort of gut-level intuition that we then use system two to rationalize. So we have an immediate visceral reaction, and then we think about something via system two. And the reason that's interesting is because intuition, according to Kahneman and others, is subjected to certain kinds of influences that are really quite interesting, but also sort of beyond our ability to reason about. And one of my favorite examples actually from the book, and one that I find works really well on students, is you ask a large group of students, you know, you give them the scenario that they're planning a wedding or something, and they have 25 tables, and each centerpiece costs $17. You know, how much money do they need to buy all the centerpieces? They take out a pen and paper. You know, they write sort of carefully, think about it. Some of them can't do it, unfortunately, but a lot of them can, and they come up with the right answer. And almost everybody actually gets that right. And then you ask them a simpler question, which is, you know, you want to buy a bat and a ball. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And they, you know, sort of quickly put down their answer and they put it up. And then you show that, you know, 90%, 95% of them get the second one wrong, because they our intuition. Comes from system one. It's people's intuitive gut feelings. That's what generates disagreement. What they say about their political arguments is just rationalization. So he uses the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. System one, emotion, intuition, is an elephant. System two, rationality, is the rider. The rider can control the elephant when the elephant isn't agitated, but when the elephant is agitated, the rider has no hope. So this is Jonathan Haidt's moral intuitionism argument. In fact, there is quite a bit of evidence suggesting that to some degree, people's political preferences may well be something that they have inherited genetically from their parents. It's a controversial line of argument, but there is quite convincing evidence in support of it, not least of which is that identical twins, for example, tend to be much more alike politically than our non-identical twins, despite the fact that both identical twins and non-identical twins have the same parents, are the same age, are raised in the same household, went to the same school, tend to have the same kind of peer groups, and so on. And yet, overwhelmingly, identical twins are more likely to be similar to each other politically in a number of important respects than our non-identical twins. And this is evidence, many argue, for perhaps genetic predispositions. And if politics is genetically ingrained, it's again a pretty good evidence that this is not just a disagreement about facts. One slide that I particularly like to show, and just to give you an example of this, one of the key features of political disagreement is the extent to which people attach themselves to political parties, like sports teams, and cheer for their political party, no matter who the candidate is, who the actors are, or what their policies are. They will cheer for their political party and support their political party no matter what. And one graph, this is sort of an American graphic. It's a bit of a long story behind it, but basically the story goes like this. Companies often track and use market research to track brand loyalty. So they will, for example, in this case, it's Godfather's Pizza. So Godfather's Pizza commissions a series of surveys which asks people to rate how their pizza tastes on a scale where -15 or so means disgusting or whatever, and 20 means it tastes delicious. And they send this out to market research companies, and they pay money for the firm to conduct the survey. And then usually the firm, because for different kinds of reasons, but for example, if they want to actually, maybe pitch some of the survey results to media outlets, they might also ask people at the end of the survey, what political party do you belong to, right? So we get an assessment of pizza taste and then an identification of sort of party affiliation. And, not surprisingly, over time, when you ask Democrats, Republicans, and Independents whether they like the taste of Godfather's Pizza, there's no difference, right? I mean, why would there be any difference in how people who vote for different political parties think about the taste of Godfather's Pizza? Until Herman Cain, who is a former CEO of Godfather's Pizza, announces his candidacy for the Republican nomination for president. And all of a sudden, Republicans start to like the taste of Godfather's Pizza even more, and Democrats like it a little less. Then it turns out that Herman Cain is embroiled in a sexual harassment scandal at Godfather's Pizza, and all of a sudden it's the best pizza Republicans have ever tasted, and Democrats can't stand it. Now, this is, sort of an example of party effects. But the point that is sort of made repeatedly is that this is the exact same phenomena that you see about opinions on war and peace, opinions on abortion, opinions on race relations, opinions on all kind of fundamental moral questions track to a considerable degree for sizable segments of the population, people's basic party affiliations. This is especially true in the United States. It is also true in Canada, though not quite to the same degree. So where does the media fit in here? And I'm mindful of time. I would just say that sort of when we initially started to think about media effects, we assumed that because everybody really only gets political information from the media would have this massive effect, right? The media, in effect, would control how people thought. But when we went out and looked for evidence, scholars found, first of all, very minimal effects. The media didn't seem to have an overwhelming influence on what people thought about politics and what people thought about moral issues. But subsequent research found that we might have been looking in the wrong place, even though, as pointed out, even though the media may not be very successful at telling us what to think, it was, as Cohen found, stunningly successful in his words at telling people what to think about. So the issues that we tend to think about are influenced quite heavily by the media, even if what we think about those issues is not. There's also the issue of framing. So how we think about the issue, the kinds of considerations we bring to bear on an issue are also, some evidence suggests, heavily influenced by media. One interesting sort of paradox, and one of the factors that may potentially, or at least historically, may have potentially limited media effects is the following. People with high levels of sophistication are highly unlikely or less likely to be influenced by the media when they read a story. They read a story, they might be able to see that the story is biased, they understand that, and because they're highly sophisticated, they're not influenced by it. People who have less sophistication, however, when they do see a media story or a political story in the media, they don't recognize the bias, they don't know that maybe this is just one side of the story, and so they are, in fact, influenced by it. The problem, though, is that the people who are highly disengaged and highly unsophisticated about politics are unlikely to actually see political news because they don't seek it out or whatever, whereas the people who are highly sophisticated are the ones most likely to get political news. So the issue here is that those most likely to be influenced by political news are the least likely to actually see it, and those most likely to see political news are the least likely actually to be influenced by it. So this is one of the things that was thought historically to limit the impact of the media on people's political views. But I think we might raise serious questions nowadays about the extent to which this is still true. I mean, people who are not politically interested are on Facebook, they're on Twitter, And it's very possible that they're getting political news in their feeds, even if they're not seeking it out. So we may need, and I think we do need, a sort of a new model. So just quickly, what are the prospects? Where are we? Well, a very influential argument, political scientist Morris Fiorina with Sam Abrams and Jeremy Pope, makes the argument that, in fact, there really is no sort of culture war. He says we're closely divided, but not deeply divided. And, the argument is further that elites are divided, but really the people aren't, right? This is the thing. So it's talking heads are divided, politicians are divided, but the people aren't. And we might ask, is this true? And the answer is no, it is not true, and it's less true than it was when they wrote their book. This is a graphic, the same thing occurs in Canada actually, but this is a graphic which shows over time how Democrats feel about both their own political party, the Democratic Party, and how they feel about Republicans. Year is plotted along the horizontal axis. Vertical axis captures feeling thermometer ratings, which range from 0, meaning you hate them, to 100, meaning you love them, with 50 being sort of neutral response category. And what you see here is that over time, Democrats are equally favorable about their own party, standard about 80, but become increasingly opposed to the Republican Party. So it's no longer they love the Democrats and are neutral about the Republicans. Now they love the Democrats and hate the Republicans. And the exact opposite trend occurs in the Republican Party. They're now still favorable about their own party, but hate the Democrats more and more. We see exactly the same thing in Canada. So political disagreement is becoming more intense. And this is just one measure. There are many other measures of exactly the same, that find exactly the same thing. So what are the conclusions, implications? Well, first, the 2016 U.S. presidential election did not come out of nowhere. This has been building for quite some time, and frankly, I think an election like the last one was expected. Whether the next one will be worse or better, if the trend continues, it'll be worse, right? And that's saying something because it was pretty bad. American politics, like the politics of many other countries, including Canada, is getting more divided and more embittered, and has been for a very long time. So this isn't a new thing. It may be a temporary thing, but it's a temporary in a matter of decades, not years. And the best defense against manipulation seems to be still sophistication. But there is no defense in a free society against disagreement. I think we'll hear a little bit about that as well from Matt. So that's my presentation. Thanks for your time.
All right. What are we doing on the slides? Oh, perfect. So yes, my name is Matthew Feinberg. I'm at U of T in Rotman in the organizational behavior group. And though we didn't coordinate this, I think you'll see a lot of interesting overlap between our talks that complement each other. So I'm very excited about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about morality, framing, and effective political communication in that type of polarized world that we live in. Okay, so first off, just to get you in the mindset, think about the times that you've either witnessed or been involved in a political debate, let's say, political argument maybe, with somebody from the other side of the political spectrum. It could be on any topic. It could be about abortion. It could be about use of military force. It could be about the refugee crisis in Syria. Think about how that went for you, or how it went if you were watching it on TV or something like that. Chances are, if your experience is anything like mine, or when I should add that I'm from the US, so I get to see this all the time, things don't go so well. So political disagreement often starts with people just not getting it. They get upset, they get annoyed with each other, they get disgruntled, it gets a little out of control, people start calling each other names, you lie, you're stupid, you're ignorant, you are immoral. And ultimately, in luckily not too many instances, but does happen on occasion, where it gets a little out of control. And rarely ever does it end with somebody saying, you know what, I agree with you. So something's going on here with our political communication. It does not seem to be very effective. And the question I had in a lot of my research is, why does political communication why does it go so wrong? Why does it not work? Why are we so ineffective? Okay, so what I want to do is take you through 3 points that complement Chris's points perfectly, and they're about morality. So the first one is political attitudes are usually grounded in moral values. And this especially applies to those heated, hot-button issues that we're most likely to debate. They're grounded in moral values. But the key here is that they're not grounded, or the debate is not grounded in everyone having the same moral values. It's grounded in people having different moral values. Okay, so let me take you through some research that shows what the different values are that seem to exist, and then we'll talk about how liberals and conservatives presumably have different levels of endorsement for these different values. So there are 5 moral foundations. Some people argue others, but recent research suggests there's these 5 that you could endorse. It doesn't mean you endorse all of them. They just exist, and the research has found that some people endorse these, some people endorse others. Okay, so the first, harm care, and that highlights how you should be compassionate. You should care for those who are suffering and in need, and it'd be really wrong to harm those people or neglect them. Another one of the foundations is the fairness, reciprocity, moral foundation. This emphasizes being fair and treating people equally and making sure people are not discriminated against. Third one is in-group loyalty, which is more or less falls in the domain of putting your group above other groups, or a great example of this is patriotism, saying, well, my group is the best group. And actually saying that is a moral thing to do to many people. And saying, well, our groups are equal, or betraying your group in any way is actually an immoral act for people that endorse this foundation. There's also the authority respect foundation, emphasizing how we should recognize hierarchy and obey the responsibilities we have in that hierarchy. So if someone above us in the hierarchy says, oh, you should do this, we should do that. It's the moral thing to do. And this goes in line with ideas about tradition. So think about how tradition says you should do certain things. These are your responsibilities. By not going along with tradition, you're actually being immoral. And finally, one of the most controversial foundations is the purity-sanctity domain. And this is directly linked to religion and this idea that certain things should be pure. They should be perfect or chaste in our minds. And the important thing about all these 5 foundations, as I alluded to, is that not everybody endorses them equally. And to some extent, some people endorse some, and to some extent, people endorse others. And this is kind of the foundation of polarization in a lot of ways. And in particular, what is found in the research is that the top 2 are more strongly endorsed by liberals relative to conservatives, whereas the bottom 3 are more strongly endorsed by conservatives than they are liberals. And people like Jonathan Haidt, who Chris mentioned, make the argument that this is one of the main foundations for why we see such political polarization across various moral issues, hot-button issues, in various societies, not just the US, but Canada and beyond. Okay, so that's one thing to know about morality. Let's talk about another thing. This one may seem intuitive, but we don't necessarily apply it all the time, which is our morality is sacred. And the worst thing we can do is compromise our morality. Morality is not to be compromised. In fact, compromising morality is immoral in itself. Now, this is important to take into consideration because oftentimes people are actually asking you to compromise your morality. Not usually in this way, but what if I asked you, how much would I have to pay you to kick a puppy? So if I actually had the money in front of you right now and there was a puppy right here, you'd probably be outraged by the sheer questioning, would you kick this poor little cute puppy? People would be offended by that. And that kind of is a good illustration of how I'm asking you to compromise your values. And if it was actually happening, I know it's funny, but if it was actually happening, you'd be like, what's wrong with me for even asking that question? That's because I'm asking you to compromise some of your foundational values. Okay, so asking people to compromise their values or their morality is often offensive. And the third thing to know is that morality blinds, metaphorically, and it causes what we deem a moral empathy gap. And what this is, I'll take you through, is founded on a few important principles about morality and moral psychology. So first off, your morality is the morality. And it's a really important principle to understand, like, when something feels moral, it's intuitively correct. If something is moral to you, it just, well, duh, it's moral. 2 + 2 is 4, not 5. Same way, this is a moral issue, this is the morally correct thing to do. It's obvious. It's the same as a fact. And along those lines, because it's so obvious, because it's so intuitive and connected with our emotions, as Chris suggested. It just feels like, how could anybody not feel the same way I do? So it's a fact. 2 + 2 is 4. This is moral. This is immoral. How could anybody not feel the exact same way I do? So morality is experienced as being universal to us. And as a result of these two key points, we often fail to recognize that first thing I introduced is that different people have different notions of morality. It's really difficult for us to sit down and say, that person has a different profile of morality than I do. Because to us, morality is morality. There's no changes, there's no gray area on it. It's just morality, it's facts. Okay, so we fail to recognize, acknowledge, and understand the morality that other people may have. Okay, so you can think about political disagreement, political communication, political arguments, incorporating or encapsulating all these key points about morality. So if you have liberals who are thinking about certain moral foundations when they're thinking about their political stances and the foundations of those political stances, like harm care and fairness reciprocity foundations, and they're about to talk to a conservative who's thinking about the other 3 moral foundations, you can imagine that's not going to go so well, because they're coming from a totally different area, and there's a good chance they might offend each other because they're talking about their own morality and suggesting the other person's morality is not correct. So kind of summarize that, as a result, we don't make effective political arguments and instead often offend those we're trying to persuade. So let me take you through an example study real quickly of what we did. We invited participants who we knew were liberal and strong supporters of same-sex marriage to take part in a study for pay that we just simply said, hey, write an argument in favor of same-sex marriage that is specifically targeted at convincing conservatives who do not support same-sex marriage. And we said, if you write a good argument and actually convince people that are conservative, we'll give you $50 extra for participating. So we gave them a good incentive, and we found, of the hundreds of people, we went through and coded, and we found 2 main things that happen in line with our hypotheses. First, people wrote things like, why would we punish these people for being born a certain way? They deserve equal rights. Now, that's probably a fine argument to a lot of people who endorse in favor of same-sex marriage. It's probably a fine argument, it's particular to liberals, because it's in line with the more liberal notions of morality, of fairness and reciprocity. So we saw a lot of that. Not too surprising, you're speaking in your own moral terms. We also found a good number of people saying things like this. Jesus don't give a crap whether 2 dudes or 2 chicks get married. Now this is not only not speaking to the other side's values, this is actually challenging the other side's values. Assuming that the other side connects their purity sanctity concerns, which conservatives tend to do, with religion, then you have a challenging or saying, your morality is not important here. You're completely wrong in your morality. And you can imagine that does not go over well to tell somebody that their morality and their religion is not important in this case. So, kind of a summary of what we found, and we've done this not just with getting liberals to try to persuade conservatives, but conservatives to try to persuade liberals on various issues. Same result all the time. What we do when we make our political arguments is we appeal to our own values and not the values of the people that we're targeting, which is problematic because often it turns into us saying, you should listen to my values, not your own, compromise your values, put your values aside, because mine are the right values. And that doesn't go well. It often offends people. And in the end, you're never very persuasive. And often, it's the opposite. You end up polarizing people even further. Okay, so that leads to the question, all right, that's the problem. What do we do about it? And one thing we can do, we've discovered, is what we call moral reframing. And it's pretty intuitive after what I've put forth. Is a simple idea of making your political arguments so that they appeal to the moral values of the person you're speaking to. Now, it could be considered a strategic trick, or it could be considered simply a good way to show that you empathize with the person you're speaking to. So let me give you some examples of how this would work. Again, we were very interested in persuading conservatives about same-sex marriage and seeing what was the best argument that you could get a liberal, for a liberal who's writing this argument to make an argument that would be persuasive to conservatives. So there's 2 ways that we thought of talking about this. One would be to talk in the more typical way, which is grounded in the fairness reciprocity domain that we talked about. So we used what other participants had written as kind of a guide to come up with our own more typical argument that emphasized things like this. The law requires that all citizens be treated equally and have the same opportunity to pursue happiness. Legalizing same-sex marriage is the only fair course of action in a country founded on the principle of equality. Okay, definitely in the fairness reciprocity domain. Very typical argument, you probably have heard this very similar argument made in favor of same-sex marriage. But we also wanted to see what would happen if we flipped it. We morally reframed it and highlighted the moral values of the target as opposed to the person, the liberal, who's trying to be the most persuasive. So what we did in this condition, we chose a moral foundation that's more in line with conservative moral foundations, and that is the in-group loyalty idea, and a lot of it's to do with patriotism and that we're all in it together. So we emphasize things like same-sex couples are proud and patriotic Americans. Like other proud Americans, gay couples peacefully build lives together, buy homes, and contribute to the American economy and society. So you can see how we're emphasizing we're all in it together, we're all part of the same country. Okay? When we look at results, it's pretty clear. So the top line is the liberals. They weren't really affected by what we did. But most importantly, we're trying to persuade conservatives in this situation. And you can see if they were in the fairness condition, they scored significantly lower than if they were in the in-group loyalty condition. So what we're doing kind of as an overview is we're speaking to the moral values of conservatives to get a liberal attitude or political stance to be supported more. But of course, we didn't want to be one-sided and only see if we could persuade conservatives, so we also tried to flip liberals' attitudes, or at least persuade liberals' attitudes a bit. So in the States, military spending is a big topic, especially these days with budgetary issues going on. So typically, conservatives are all gung-ho about, let's spend more on the military and build more guns and stuff, whereas liberals are always trying to slow that down and prevent it. So the typical argument in favor of military spending that's put forth by typically conservative Republicans is kind of a blend of authority respect morality and in-group loyalty morality. And it goes something along these lines. The military unifies us at home and abroad. The military makes us the greatest superpower the world has ever seen. The military makes America great. Anyway, so this is a typical argument. It's grounded in more conservative notions of morality, authority respect, and in-group loyalty. But what happens if we switch it up? Can we get liberals to be more supportive of that stance of military spending if we emphasize something like fairness reciprocity concerns? So what if we said, through the military, the disadvantaged and poor can achieve equal standing? Being in the military means having a reliable salary and a future apart from the challenges of poverty and inequality. So we're totally reframing the issue into a different moral foundation, something that would appeal to liberal values. And just like the other study, but now looking at how it persuaded liberals, we see a pretty similar pattern. Conservatives not really affected. Liberals, when you change the values that we're speaking about it in terms of, you get that difference. So in-group loyalty and authority respect doesn't really move liberals. But the fairness reciprocity argument definitely had more of an effect. Okay, so we've done moral reframing, as we call it, in various studies, so same-sex marriage, military spending. We've been successful in getting conservatives to be more supportive of Obamacare or universal health care by emphasizing, this was kind of a tricky one, by emphasizing how the purity sanctity domain is actually in play here, by emphasizing how sick people are gross. And if you don't have universal health care, sick people are everywhere around you and they could contaminate you and everybody's getting sick and it's gross. And somehow that actually worked. For the environment and environmentalism, same idea. You can emphasize instead of the harm care foundation, like environmental degradation is destroying the earth and it's harming us all and harming animals, harming trees, doesn't really do much for conservative participants. But if you emphasize the purity side about how gross and contaminating the pollution is and how it goes into our water and we drink contaminated water and how disgusting that is, all of a sudden conservatives seem to be more environmentally friendly. And lastly, recently, we did this with the campaigns and right before the election with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and we were successful getting people, actually we had trouble getting people more supportive of their candidates, but we were able to get liberals to be less supportive of Hillary Clinton, and we were able to get conservatives to be less supportive of Donald Trump using the same type of framing technique. So all in all, it seems like this is something that you could do to be effective in your persuading strategy. but also it's a demonstration that you recognize the other person's morality and you at least care enough to speak to that morality. So a sign of empathy and perspective taking. But all in all, just as a recap, 3 things to know about morality. Political attitudes are usually grounded in moral values, but liberals and conservatives espouse different levels of these values, these different foundations. Number 2 is to keep in mind that morality is sacred and not to be compromised. But a lot of times by what we say in our political debates and arguments, that's all we're doing is we're saying, you're wrong, your morality is wrong. And, oh, I skipped one, but let's go back. Morality blinds and causes moral empathy gaps. And that's just the fact that morality is so intuitive and so factual to us that it's really hard to recognize that there are different morals out there and that people that we're speaking to actually have different moralities they endorse, or moral foundations they endorse. So as a result, we typically appeal to our own notions of morality when making political arguments, and our arguments often imply the other side, their values are completely wrong, they should compromise them, and that's often offensive to those people, and rarely are we persuasive. But the good news is at least there's one way to sort of get around this, and that is to recognize the other side has different values and speak to those different values, and at least you'll be more effective, and you'll signal, hey, I empathize with you, I perspective take, and I care about your foundations, your moral foundations as well. And one thing we've actually found a little bit of is if we teach people to do this, they're more likely to say, yeah, I respect the other side more. So you're starting to show empathy, perspective taking, and it seems to pay off. Okay, so thank you very much.
So at least Dan and I are going to have mics, I expect. I'm shocked if there's not a bunch of questions. And so when you get if you want to ask a question, just make sure you stand. So once you wave us down. Would anyone like to start? Yeah. And gentlemen, I found that fascinating. This is really neat content that I think is a little bit not part of your average PD session. So thanks a lot to the both of you.
Hello, my name is Scott Montgomery from Upper Grand. My question is, recently came to my attention that in the United States, the FCC removed the requirement to have balanced reporting back in the Reagan years. How do we safeguard this in Canada to make sure that our entire citizenry is well informed with a balanced view?
It's an excellent question. I mean, I don't have a definitive answer, but I do have thoughts on it from sort of researching in the area for a number of years. And it is that the supply side arguments are still important, but are no longer sort of a solution to the pressing problems. There's just so many sources of information. There's so many ways for people to circumvent officially supported media organizations, for example. There are so many organizations out there who are just dedicated, in some cases by multi-$100 million grants from companies or from those with an interest. In other cases, by billion-dollar-plus grants by governments to try to influence populations to see the world in a particular way. So I think from an information control perspective, the horse is already out of the barn, and I think where we need to shift is in really focusing on how precisely we equip people to be very, sort of careful consumers of information that they receive. And I don't mean just, young people, students, or people who don't follow politics, but everybody, including me, including Matt, including all of us. How do we equip ourselves and other people with the tools to carefully assess the information that we receive? And we don't have all the answers to that. I think Matt's work spoke quite a bit to what some of the strategies might be, at least in the case of an arguments. But I really don't think that a supply-side explanation is going to do it anymore in our information environment, where people choose their own material, their own sources, and can circumvent almost any official mechanisms that we put in place.
Hi. I don't know if I'm going to phrase this properly, but do with what you can. You framed a lot of your discussion cognitively and like conservative liberal. Now in our world, it's a lot of adult to teenager brain difference, right? We're the rational, if you want to call it that, and they're the intuitive. How can we kind of marry those two worlds to make our jobs kind of more effective and hopefully easier?
It's a tough one.
Think about this one.
I've got a 12-year-old, so I'm going to need to know the answer to this, I think, soon enough. Well, I mean, I don't know what it's like to be in a classroom with teenagers. I think one of the main constraints that you face as well is you're limited in sort of what you can say because of sort of parental concerns and other sorts of things. And so I don't have an answer, actually, to the question. I mean, I think one of the general points that applies as well, even to university students, is equipping people with, I don't want to use the term, but sort of infrastructure, or equipping them with with knowledge of the design of what a persuasive argument looks like and what an unpersuasive argument looks like, without necessarily filling in the blanks of content, is, I think, perhaps one of our, hopefully not last hopes, but one of our hopes about insulating people. Because as soon as we start to add content, it seems to me, in my experience, people immediately get their back up, right? So if you want to talk about religious versus scientific arguments, or you want to talk about, the difference between fact and opinion, as soon as you try to put content in there, maybe not young kids, but certainly by the time they're university age or in high school, are probably already, triggered in some way to have a view of what you're saying. But so I think the overall architecture, which is really what we try to do as educators anyway, right? I mean, it's trying to teach people how to think. One of the real questions, and again, I think Matt's work here is speaking to this more than anything that I've sort of come across, but one of the real questions would be, what do you do then at moral impasses, right? Because the moral impasses are significant. It's not like, I think we have to acknowledge that they're there, but it's not always the case that we can simply agree to disagree. I mean, to some degree we have to do that, but it's going to be significant. So really, how do we navigate those situations? And that, I think, is a challenging one that's certainly beyond what I have been able to figure out in my own work.
I'll take a shot at it. So one thing to keep in mind is this thing called morality-based groups or moral communities form, and they become very, very homogeneous. And I can imagine in a classroom that could take place, but ideally one way to prevent that is to have first train people in discourse, but to highlight that there is diversity, there's homogeneity in the classroom, and they're your peers that you're friends with, that you respect in other domains. And I think that is one way to introduce that my opinion, my morality is not the only morality. And as long as it's kept civil, that's going to be the first step to respect, and also recognizing that I should question my own notions, and even if I don't want to compromise my own notions, at least understand that people come from different angles. The other thing that's important that some research suggests is the case is we can talk about issues, whatever it is, whether it's moral, political, or anything else, at a concrete level or an abstract level. And abstract would be, not numbers, it would not be specifics, it would just be, actually Donald Trump's a great example. He talks about things very, very abstract, never provides details, and that's actually very influential because that's also where morality often lives, and a lot of strong persuasive arguments live at this abstract level where we don't really know what exactly is going to happen, but we know that it's going to happen. That's the wonderful side of it. So one thing to do to prevent that and to try to take a little bit of morality out of the equation is to talk specifically about concrete numbers, about how something would be implemented, how it would specifically affect people. Not that they would be happy or sad, but like how would it affect people in concrete terms, exactly. And then hopefully people move away from the domain of morality and their own intense emotions and moral intuitions, and they start to think in more rational, logical terms. Not that morality is always irrational, but that might be a way to do it.
Matthew, with what you said about over this way, there. Hey. What you said about the moral foundations, I can see that being really valuable for us as teachers, especially working with like persuasive writing and speaking and things like that with our students. I'm wondering, with politicians and the political spectrum today, is the value of using the other side's moral foundations for your argument worth it, or is it more worthwhile for you to drum up support with those who are like-minded and and get your support that way? Like, is there a value to discourse, or is there a value to just promotion of your own side more so?
It's a great question. So it seems that politicians have decided it's better just to find my base, speak to my base, and hope that my base is bigger than your base. And that's the idea of political discourse, or what is actually a foundation of liberal democracy, is debate and compromise, has more or less started to go out the window or out the door. And I think exactly that. Like that's the foundation of liberal democracy. It works because you find compromise, because you discuss. And for those reasons, I think we should prioritize it. But the natural inclination for people is to go the other direction and find people that are like-minded, form your moral enclaves, your echo chambers, and at least at a campaign level, that's what people are doing. I don't know if it exactly answers your question, but I guess that the hope would be that it's important to highlight why we should emphasize speaking across the aisle, or speaking to other people's morality and understanding other people's morality. But it's not necessarily the easiest path, and it's not necessarily the most intuitive path.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, just briefly, I mean, I would say that there's two struggles. One is to try to persuade new people to vote for you. The other is to try to ensure that your people get out to vote, right? So there's the motivational side and then a persuasive side. And, two things about the last American election, I think, that are striking and often lost in the conversation about it is, first, that the result, if you take away the candidates, is eminently predictable, right? You had a two-term Democratic president, you have some malaise in the population, and so we would have actually expected an outsider to have an advantage at that point, first thing. So other than Trump, generic Republican candidate is expected to win the last election. And the second thing is just how strikingly the voting patterns were similar to previous years. I mean, basically the same folks who voted Republican historically voted Republican again, and the same with the Democrats. What seems to be a bit of a difference is that, some tens of thousands of people swung historically non-Republican voters, and more significantly, in my view, a lot of Obama voters stayed home, right? So it was a motivational gap. So I think those are the two elements. There's persuasion and motivation, and politicians really struggle with where to pitch the line there. And I think in the last election, I mean, to some extent, because of the outcome, Republicans were more successful than Democrats, which some argue has been the history of American politics for quite some time on moral issues.
Hi, thanks again for taking all these questions. I have a question, even though it opens a can of worms that we tried to keep closed earlier. It's about the mydemocracy.ca, the information gathering. I think Vote Compass was involved in that survey about democratic institutions. Am I right about that?
Yeah, Vox Pops Labs was the company that commissioned, or the company that carried it out for the government, yes.
Okay. My question is, what were the lessons learned from the backlash? I mean, it seemed like a fairly sophisticated, to steal your terminology, a sophisticated reframing of a divisive issue, but the backlash in the media and in the general public was ugly. Were the lessons learned about institutions, governments actually trying to do that reframing of issues?
So that's a great question. I'm not involved in any way with the company that commissioned it, and not a way of sort of distancing myself from their work, though it is, I guess. Yeah, I mean, so I certainly have thoughts on it, but it would be entirely separate from the company that carried it out and what their lessons that they learned. And I think my view on this is that one has to be careful with how you carry out public engagement, because public engagement and public consultation can be seen to be a genuine consultative exercise of figuring out what people want to do and what interests need to be represented and discovering new arguments. But it can also be seen, frankly, as I think it was in this case, as a legitimizing exercise, which is, in other words, let's find a way to make it look like we consulted the public so that we can proceed with what we want to do anyway. I don't know what the government learned from that survey. I mean, I think the backlash in any of this kind of work is inevitable, and to some degree, perfection can be the enemy of the good. But I think whenever you go out into a politically contentious domain with a set of questions, and the government is involved and are sort of involved in figuring out which questions are asked or which questions are not, one has to be careful about not sort of undermining people's faith in say, social scientific work, for example, by seeming to be a kind of a mouthpiece for the government. So in this case, I actually think the government ultimately, in my own view, is that did the right thing by backing away because they didn't have the support. And I think the problem was how the process played out from the get-go. They seemed to have one outcome in mind. I can't speak for them, but they seemed to have a preferred outcome in mind that they weren't able to implement. And once they realized that, they stepped away. So is that really public consultation? In my view, it is, in the sense that they decided not to proceed, but it isn't in the sense that I don't think they genuinely sought out the public support about what reform to institute. Would be my own view of it.
Matt, you're probably okay not getting lost in that, right? Okay. Just what's a read on how many questions are left? Because I admit we cut off questions a bit too early last night. So who has questions so we can figure out how much more time we give to this? At least a bunch. Calvin, you were in line. So, Dan, Calvin's first, okay? Okay. Is that okay? Make sure it's a good one.
Hope so. Hi, Calvin Arndt, from Niagara. And first of all, both the presentations were excellent. I loved them. So, I might sound a little critical here, but worldwide there's Antifa and anti-com groups that seem to be mobilizing no matter which country, which government is in charge. And I'm just wondering, is there a way that we can direct or channel their actions so that they work the way politicians would like them to work? And I guess, and the criticism of your presentations now is that I'm wondering if your presentations would be truthful to the soft voter, but when it comes to Antifa and anti-com people, they seem pretty committed, and I would question whether your research would be applicable to those groups because they are hardcore committed people. Your research might be fine for the soft voter, but I'm not so sure about the others, so thanks.
Yeah, it's definitely a good question. One point that it won't fully speak to your question, but one interesting thing about how we divide liberals and conservatives on the graph, and I won't get into the stats, is actually the people that were most persuaded by our manipulations were the people that were further and further along the spectrum. So the more conservative you are, the more you endorse the conservative moral foundations, the more that if you speak to, as researchers or as politicians, the more that we speak to those foundations, the more that affects the people that are further to the right or to the left. But you're absolutely right, there's probably people that are way beyond the participants that we had, and there's definitely research that suggests those people are not going to be moving based on a simple study like this. It's going to take a lot more effort. And yeah, what that effort is, I'm not exactly sure. I'll hand that one over.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer for these folks either. I mean, I would just say in general, and this is a long-term, several thousand years of sort of a struggle with the systems government in general. There are people who refuse to accept debate as a legitimate way of settling differences. And once you're there, and violence is the recourse, politics by other means, right? As is often said, I don't think persuasion works. I actually think that's a danger, and you see, I think it's still a pretty small group, but people who aren't committed to discourse. I mean, we're saying with some of Matt's work, if you're not willing to let your opponents speak, what do you think the alternative is? Do you think they're just going to change their minds or go away and shut up? And it's not the case, right? So what is the alternative to speech? And I think once people think that through, they see that the alternative to speech is violence, and nobody wants, society, or at least most people don't want society to degrade to that level. So I think the radical voices can actually be very important. The voices are important. The actions, protests, and so on can also have an influence in getting us to think about certain issues that we might have been ignorant about. But the violence, the protests, the burning, and so on, I see no good reason for it. And as I always tell my students, one of the things, whatever you think about the police, and there's always issues, I think it's important to keep in mind that the police are there to protect you from other people. Think of, for example, fascists or other groups, and some of the groups in the United States. I mean, they would love to get into a rally at, say, the University of Berkeley, for example, and inflict all kinds of violence on the others. And there's those on the other side who would do the same thing, right? So I think the state serves here as a line that tries to separate these groups and protect the rest of us. But as I said, I don't think persuasion works on those who aren't committed to dialogue and discussion. Right? So I agree with you.
Thank you very much. Given that we're here really discussing about youth engagement and in a larger context, I'm struck by the fact that my students in the elementary panel, never mind anywhere else, have clearly noticed that political discourse seems to foster and thrive on increasing political divisiveness and not the contrary. So I have two questions. interrelated. The first is, how do we, what would your comments be in terms of what do we do as educators to foster political discussions in an attempt to create more favorable dialogues, and then how do we prevent cynicism? Because that's one of the things that I'm the most concerned about when we're talking about participation in the electoral process and in the discussion of the political agendas. Thank you.
Sure. So one interesting thing that's been shown a lot is, without a doubt, there's increased polarization, exactly what Chris showed. But if you ask the average liberal, at least in the States, if you ask the average liberal, what is the average conservative like in terms of their politics, or you ask the average conservative what their liberals most like, they're way off, way off. Everybody, because they're in these enclaves now and they don't really have any interaction with people on the other side, they have no idea what the other side actually is thinking. And typically the other side is nowhere near as extreme as they think they are, which is a good sign, though things are getting more extreme and polarization is happening. But what I think that says is that the more homogeneity and breaking into these enclaves is problematic, and the more we have heterogeneity and have civil discourse as much as possible, and recognize that this person who's just like me is a Canadian or an American, just like me, has a different perspective. And in the classroom, you have 30 kids, and presumably there's diversity in opinion as long as it's maintained in a civil way. These are your friends. These are people just like you. If that's highlighted a lot, then it's really hard to say, oh, all people on the other side are crazy or different than me. And I think that's one angle to go about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a tough issue. I would emphasize commitment to the process and think in general terms about sort of the nature of democracy and deliberation and debate, and and that I think should be inculcated just as a matter of sort of education in general. Here's what alternatives look like. Here's what has happened historically when people have decided that they're not going to pursue, democracy or liberty or whatever, and so people realize what the consequences are and what the stakes are of sort of messing up the system that we've built over several generations. And I think as well, I mean, general commitment to facts. I always like the line, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. And I think a genuine commitment to facts, if you aren't committed to factual debate, I really don't see what the purpose of debate is. I mean, and I know, first of all, that a lot of political disagreement, as I mentioned, isn't about facts. But that seems to me to be the basic cost of entry, right? And so, I mean, these are things that I think the education system is aims to do and does well, and I think it's bringing people together, say in left-right terms, or sort of even introducing them to the dominant narratives. I could see some potentially counterproductive issues on doing that. I could also see some raising some flags with parents or others that might not want their children to be exposed to certain kinds of arguments or whatever. But I think in general, a commitment to process, to democracy, to elections, to voting, an understanding of the system of government, understanding of what some of the dismal alternatives are, all of those things I think prepare our students at least to go out into the world, hopefully motivated to keep a peaceful society together rather than to tear it apart. So.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Yemi. Going back to American election, I just have some, questions. My students find it difficult to believe that somebody who has almost 5 million votes less is now the president of the U.S. because of the electoral college concept. Is there any research going on to gauge the people's opinion about the use of electoral concepts in the U.S. elections?
Wow. So I can only speak to, ironically, my enclave that my Facebook enclave that I see the responses. Yeah, and people are very unhappy with what happened, and it's commonly, whenever Trump does something that people are not happy with it, it's very quick to remind, well, he's not really the president because he didn't win by a popular majority, even though we have the electoral college system. And this has actually happened that where the winner was actually not the one who had the majority vote numerous times, and not too distant history. In 2000 it happened as well. And it's the irony of it is that the person who wins is the one who could change the system pretty much. Not necessarily just the president, but the power structure that takes power is the one who benefited from the Electoral College. So it's rare that you would think, oh, well, let's change the system that just put me in place. It also signals I'm not the legitimate president. So if Donald Trump was in favor of ending the Electoral College, which he had mentioned prior to the election, then it would be a signal to everybody, oh, I actually lost, but I'm your president. So it's this ironic dilemma that anybody who gains the power has no incentive and actually has a disincentive to change the system. But without a doubt, if you ever live in the States during an election year, or actually now an election 2 years, because they start the campaign 2 years in advance, if you live in Ohio, Michigan, a swing state, you hate yourself, you hate your life, because every second of your life is a bombardment of phone calls, TV commercials, or something else that is just, here's why you have to vote for this person. Because those are the states that the politicians care about. If you are from California, where I'm registered to vote, no one cares about you, because it's a guarantee blue state. And as a result, you aren't really part of the political process except you vote. But everybody knows what California is going to do. It's going to go blue. Everybody knows what New York's going to do. It's going to go blue. And of course, on the flip side, everybody knows where Texas and Alabama are going to go. But those swing states, that's actually what makes the democratic process now, and it's very, very problematic.
Yeah, the great quote in the last election was, don't move to Canada, move to a swing state, right, for Democrats. I mean, you think about it. I mean, American elections decided by tens of thousands of voters, handfuls of voters, effectively. Country of, whatever, 360 million people in certain states, right? But that is a part of their system, and I think all the candidates know that they have to find a way to win within the system, right? So, or at least that's what they're aiming to do. But I agree.
We have to end it, but we're going to go with one last question.
Sorry to keep everyone seated for an extra minute. You wanted to kick the puppy based on money. So I was wondering if morally, is it easier to swing people if there's an economic tie to the policy, or if that makes no difference at all? Thank you.
Depends on, so are you talking about economic, like my pocketbook, or economics more generally? Yeah, so historically it was, people thought politics, and hopefully I'm not overstepping my knowledge, but politics was largely self-interest voters, and people voted for their pocketbooks. But that's clearly not the case anymore. There are lots of books highlighting how people vote against their self-interest all the time. But to your point, at a larger level, I think I would agree that if you take it out of the abstract domain, so this is right and this is wrong, where morality often lives, and take it to the more concrete domain and add numbers, and that's definitely what economic policies typically do, and say, here's what would happen if we implemented this policy, here's the amount of money that we would earn or lose, and all these specifics, then you have something to discuss and debate, and you can argue over facts more than you can argue over emotions and intuitions. But that is also the downfall of many politicians, is going in that realm. So Hillary Clinton tried to talk about facts. Barack Obama tried to talk about facts when he was president and talk about specific details, and no one gets persuaded by that, because they want to hear this moral language, this stuff that appeals to their intuitions, their emotions. So it's a very complicated thing. So ideally, yeah, people would be persuaded, and we'd have more civil discourse if we were talking in terms of numbers and economics, but it's just not the natural thing for people to want to hear and do. So we have to find a way to make people interested in that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and that applies, in some cases as well. You could say to Democrats, but it does seem to apply especially to Republicans, at least recently. I mean, I would say, though, one thing I would add: a surprisingly large number of people would kick a puppy for money, right? I mean, if you look at the survey, I mean, I agree that we would think, of course, nobody would do that, and most people we would say are normal wouldn't, but a surprisingly large number of people would, and I think that's been a sort of perennial feature. So I would just recommend, if anyone really wanted to test that out, don't. Right? Because you will not be happy with the result, in my experience. Yeah. And Jonathan Knight actually had the great one, right? If all these folks are atheists, I think one of his articles is actually titled, "Why Won't Atheists Sell Their Soul?" Right? People will commit that they're atheists, and you ask them to sell you their soul in a contract for a couple of bucks, right? And they won't do it. So there's interesting kinds of things when we think of intuition and reasoning and how these work in the context of debate, and I think Matt's work taps it very nicely. Thanks.
What do you think?
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much. Invoice and all that sort of thing, but this was wonderful. Yeah. Great. I had wandered around and asked a couple people just to ensure that I wasn't projecting my own interest in this, but I think, let's see, what's your name tag say? Dave. Oh, yeah, hey, Dave. Yeah, we worked with you for a while. Good to see you. Maybe just, how does this help you? I'm putting you on the spot on purpose.
How does it help me?
Yeah, stand up. Ooh. Just get the conversation. We got to do some.
This was not prearranged, by the way.
Sorry about
Well, now that I'm up here, being here, I find the best professional development, in my opinion, is being with other educators and comparing notes and seeing what they do in their classes and what works and what fails. So for me, that's the value of being here. I mean, obviously hearing great speakers is hugely valuable, but then sharing, talking with my colleagues, at any time we can, for me is the best part of this experience.
Great. That's a perfect segue, actually, to what we wanted to do before lunch, which is have a bit more of a talk. And there was a few different questions that we wanted to put out to the table.